You expect this court to believe a black cleaning woman speaks 9 languages? The gavel struck once, sharp and echoing across the polished wood and marble, and a ripple of restrained laughter followed, low but unmistakable, like something slipping through cracks that weren't meant to be seen. Naomi Carter didn't flinch. She stood near the back row, just beside the aisle where the light from the tall courthouse windows stretched in long pale lines across the floor, her gray maintenance jacket still zipped halfway, a faint scent of lemon cleaner clinging to her sleeves. In her hand was a folded cloth she hadn't realized she was still holding. The courtroom felt colder than it had minutes ago, or maybe it was just the way every eye had turned toward her at once. Judge William Hargrove leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression carved from something between disbelief and quiet amusement, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be felt. He had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. Everyone had. The bailiff shifted his weight near the wall, watching, waiting, unsure if this was about to become a disruption or just another moment of someone stepping out of place. Naomi's heartbeat moved steadily, not fast, not panicked, just present, like a clock ticking somewhere behind the walls. She could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the soft rustle of legal papers being adjusted, the distant sound of traffic filtering through the thick courthouse glass. All of it grounded her. She had been in this room before, just not like this. Usually, she moved through it after hours, when the seats were empty and the voices gone, when the power in the room had no audience. Now it pressed down from every direction. The defendant sat at the far table, shoulders tense, eyes searching, not for authority, but for understanding. And Naomi had heard it. Every word that had been twisted, every meaning that had slipped between languages like something fragile dropped and left unnoticed. She lifted her chin slightly, just enough to meet the judge's gaze without defiance, without apology. "I didn't ask you to believe me, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. Clear, carrying farther than she expected in the stillness that followed. "I asked you to listen?" Another pause, longer this time. The kind that stretches thin before it breaks. Judge Hargrove's lips curved again, but slower now, measured. "Then perhaps," he said, tapping his pen lightly against the bench, "you'd like to demonstrate." A few quiet chuckles returned, softer, more controlled, but still there. Naomi felt the weight of them, but it didn't move her. The light shifted slightly as a cloud passed outside, dimming the room just enough to soften the edges of everything, the polished wood, the brass fixtures, the lines of authority etched into the architecture itself. She took one small breath, barely visible, and let the silence settle around her like something she had chosen, not something forced upon her. Because in that moment, she understood something no one else in that room did yet. This wasn't about proving she could speak 9 languages. It was about proving that the truth had been speaking the whole time, and no one with power had bothered to understand it. Naomi Carter had learned long before this day that silence could be mistaken for absence, and presence could be dismissed if it came from the wrong person, in the wrong clothes, at the wrong time. She had spent the past 11 months walking these same courthouse halls after hours, her footsteps softened by rubber soles, her reflection trailing faintly in the polished floors as she moved from one room to the next with a cart that squeaked just enough to remind her she was still there. Most nights she worked alone. The air would settle differently after 6 o'clock, heavier somehow, like the building exhaled once the voices left. That was when she listened. Not to conversations, but to echoes. Legal arguments left hanging in the air, fragments of testimony replayed in her mind as she wiped down benches and straightened chairs that had held people's futures just hours earlier. Language had always been her way of understanding the world, long before she ever stepped foot in this building. Her mother used to say that Naomi did not just hear words, she felt them, like temperature or texture. Growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Newark, she had been surrounded by voices from everywhere. Spanish from the couple downstairs, Haitian Creole from the woman across the hall, Arabic from the corner store owner who always let her take an extra piece of candy when her mother was not looking. Naomi absorbed it all without trying, repeating sounds under her breath until they became meaning, until meaning became instinct. By the time she was 16, she could move between conversations like stepping across stones in a river, never losing her balance. College had come and gone in fragments, semesters interrupted by hospital bills and long nights sitting beside her mother, translating medical jargon into something softer, something less frightening. She had not finished her degree, but the knowledge had never left her. It stayed with her, quiet and patient, waiting for a moment that mattered. The courthouse job had not been part of any plan. It was something steady, something that paid enough to keep the lights on and the refrigerator from going empty. People rarely looked at her twice. To them, she was part of the background, like the hum of the air conditioning or the faint scent of disinfectant that lingered in the corners. And that had been fine. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant no one expected anything from her. But today, standing under the weight of that courtroom, she could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. The same people who would have walked past her without a glance were now watching, measuring, deciding. Naomi lowered her hand, the folded cloth slipping quietly into her pocket, and let her shoulders settle into stillness. She did not need them to understand her past, or the years it took to carry all those languages without recognition. She only needed them to hear what had already been said, to finally understand the truth that had been waiting in plain sound all along. Judge William Hargrove had built his reputation on certainty, the kind that did not bend easily and did not apologize when it pressed down on others. From his elevated bench, he viewed the courtroom not just as a place of law, but as a structure of order, where every person had a role and every role had a boundary that was not meant to be crossed. He had spent more than 20 years refining that control, learning how to read a room in seconds, how to separate confidence from bluff, how to recognize when someone was speaking truth and when they were reaching beyond their place. To him, authority was not just granted, it was performed, reinforced in tone, posture, and the quiet expectation that others would fall in line without question. That expectation had rarely been challenged, and when it had, it was usually by seasoned attorneys who knew the rules well enough to test them. Not by someone standing in a maintenance jacket, still carrying the faint imprint of a job that existed outside the courtroom's hierarchy. He studied Naomi Carter with a gaze that had unsettled countless witnesses before her, a gaze that did not need to raise its volume to assert dominance. In his mind, he had already categorized her, not out of cruelty that he would recognize, but out of habit shaped by years of filtering people through visible markers, education, attire, position. The courtroom responded to him because it trusted that instinct, trusted that he could maintain the line between order and disruption. A misplaced voice, in his experience, was often a distraction from the facts, a momentary deviation that needed to be corrected before it spread. And yet, there was something in the stillness that followed Naomi's words that did not behave like the usual interruptions he dismissed. It lingered. The attorneys at the front table exchanged brief glances, subtle but telling, as if uncertainty had entered the room through a door no one had seen open. The official interpreter, seated to the side, adjusted his headset and papers, his fingers moving with a precision that now seemed slightly less certain than before. Hargrove noticed that. He noticed everything. The defendant's posture had shifted as well, just a fraction, but enough to suggest that something had been understood differently than intended. That was where his focus narrowed. Not on Naomi as a person, but on the possibility that the process itself had been disrupted. He leaned forward. Slightly, the polished wood of the bench catching the overhead light, and tapped his pen once more, slower this time, measured. The room quieted further, if that was even possible. He did not raise his voice, because he did not need to. "If you are going to interrupt this court," he said, each word deliberate, controlled, "then you will do so with absolute clarity." His eyes remained fixed on her, searching not for who she was, but for whether she could withstand the weight of being wrong in a place where mistakes carried consequences beyond embarrassment. For the first time in years, the certainty that had guided him paused, just enough to allow something unfamiliar to surface, not doubt exactly, but a question that had not yet been answered. And Judge William Hargrove did not like unanswered questions. Naomi did not move right away, not because she was unsure, but because she understood exactly what that tone meant, the measured cadence of someone who expected control to be returned to him within seconds. The room held its breath in that fragile space between challenge and consequence, where one wrong step could collapse everything that had just begun to shift. She stepped forward instead, just one pace into the open aisle, enough for her voice to carry without raising it, enough to be seen without asking permission. The overhead lights cast a pale reflection across the polished floor, catching the edge of her shoes, the faint crease in her uniform, the quiet steadiness in her posture. "The witness did not say what was translated," she said, her words landing clean, without hesitation. A few heads turned toward the interpreter's table again, the subtle ripple of doubt moving faster this time, more visible. Judge Hargrove's gaze sharpened, not louder, not harsher, just more focused, like a lens adjusting to bring something into sharper view. "And what exactly?" he replied, each syllable deliberate. "Did the witness say?" Naomi did not look at him immediately. Instead, she turned her attention toward the man seated at the defense table, the one whose voice had been filtered through another person's understanding. The man's hands were clasped tightly, his knuckles pale against his skin, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of fear and something else, something closer to recognition. Naomi spoke again, this time in a language that did not belong to the room, a string of syllables that moved fluidly, naturally, as if they had always been waiting just beneath the surface. The sound shifted the air itself, unfamiliar yet precise, drawing every ear in the room toward it. The defendant's head lifted, his shoulders straightening slightly, his expression changing in a way that required no translation. Naomi paused just long enough for the silence to register, then continued, repeating the statement once more, slower, clearer, each word anchored in certainty. When she turned back to English, her voice remained steady. "He said he saw someone else run," she explained. "He did not identify the defendant." The words settled into the room like weight, pressing gently but firmly against the structure that had been accepted just moments earlier. A quiet murmur began, restrained but undeniable, as attorneys leaned toward one another, papers shifting, pens hovering midair. The interpreter at the side table adjusted his headset again, his fingers moving through his notes with increasing urgency, as if searching for something that had slipped past him unnoticed. Judge Hargrove's pen stilled against the bench. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he watched Naomi with a new kind of attention, one that no longer dismissed her presence as background noise. "That is a serious claim," he said finally, his voice still controlled, but carrying a different weight now. "Do you understand the implications of what you are suggesting?" Naomi met his gaze then, fully, without lowering her eyes, without softening her stance. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. "That is why I stood up." The room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. For the first time, the question was no longer whether she belonged in that moment, but whether the truth had been sitting unnoticed in the room all along, waiting for someone who was never meant to speak to finally be heard. The air in the courtroom tightened, not with noise but with pressure, the kind that builds when something familiar begins to crack beneath the surface. Naomi could feel it in the subtle shifts around her, in the way chairs creaked as people leaned forward, in the way papers stopped moving because no one was sure what to write down next. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then the sound came, low and dismissive, cutting through the stillness like it had every right to be there. "That is not accurate," the official interpreter said, his voice controlled but edged with something defensive. He straightened in his seat, adjusting his tie as if reclaiming ground that had been taken too easily. "The witness clearly stated that he saw the defendant leaving the scene." A few heads nodded, relieved to return to something structured, something recognized. The prosecution attorney shifted forward, seizing the opening. "Your Honor, we cannot allow an unverified individual to interrupt proceedings with speculative interpretations," he said, his tone respectful but firm, as if restoring order was not just necessary, but urgent. The words settled heavily, giving shape to what many in the room were already thinking but had not yet voiced. Naomi remained where she stood, her hands still at her sides, her posture unchanged. She did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. She waited. Judge Hargrove turned slightly toward the interpreter, his expression tightening into something more analytical now, less dismissive, but not yet convinced. You are certain of your translation? He asked. The interpreter nodded without hesitation. Completely, Your Honor. The certainty landed hard, solid, something that had been built over years of trust in credentials, in titles, in roles that were clearly defined. Naomi felt the weight of that certainty pressing against her, not as doubt, but as resistance. The bailiff took a small step closer to the aisle, not aggressively, but with purpose, as if preparing to guide her out if instructed. Naomi noticed, but it did not change her stance. The defendant's eyes moved between the interpreter and Naomi, confusion deepening, his breathing visible now in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders. Something was wrong, and he knew it, even if he could not prove it. Naomi took a slow breath, the kind that steadies rather than fills, and spoke again, her voice calm but carrying further now because the room had grown so quiet. May I respond, Your Honor? She asked. The question was simple, respectful, but it held something more beneath it, not defiance, not submission, but resolve. Judge Hargrove did not answer immediately. His fingers rested against the bench, tapping once, then stopping, as if the rhythm he relied on had been interrupted. He looked at Naomi again, longer this time, searching not just for confidence, but for consistency, for any sign that she might falter under pressure. Proceed, he said finally, the word deliberate, measured, but carrying a shift that did not go unnoticed. Naomi nodded once, then turned slightly, her gaze moving between the interpreter and the witness, aligning herself not with authority, but with truth. The room leaned in again, quieter than before, more cautious. Whatever happened next would not just determine who was right. It would determine who had been heard all along, and who had not been listening at all. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because she understood that this moment did not belong to speed, it belonged to precision, to patience, to the quiet kind of courage that does not demand attention but earns it. The courtroom seemed to settle into a different rhythm, slower, heavier, as if every sound had been turned down just enough to make space for what was about to be said. The overhead lights hummed softly, a steady presence above, while a thin beam of afternoon light slipped through the tall windows, stretching across the floor and stopping just short of where she stood. Naomi let her eyes rest for a brief second on that line of light, grounding herself in something simple, something real, before she spoke again. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction, the doubt, the skepticism, the quiet hope from the man seated at the defense table, all of it layered into the air around her. Her hands remained still at her sides, fingers relaxed, not clenched, not trembling, just present. She turned slightly toward the witness, her voice soft at first, almost gentle, as she repeated the original statement again in his language, this time slower, clearer, each word shaped with care, not just for accuracy, but for meaning. The sound carried differently now, not as an interruption, but as something deliberate, something anchored. The witness responded immediately, his voice rising just enough to be heard, his expression shifting with a mix of urgency and relief, as if someone had finally opened a door he had been knocking on without success. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging him, then turned back toward the bench. She did not speak right away. Instead, she allowed the response to settle into the room, to be felt, to be noticed without explanation. The official interpreter shifted again, less certain now, his notes no longer offering the same stability they had just moments ago. Naomi could see it in the way his eyes moved, scanning, searching, recalculating. Judge Hargrove watched all of it, his posture unchanged, but his attention sharpened, drawn not by authority, but by the growing weight of inconsistency. Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady, clear, carrying across the room without strain. The structure of his sentence places the subject before the action in a way that changes the meaning entirely. She explained, her tone calm, instructional without being condescending. He did not identify the defendant as the person running. He identified that he saw someone else running away. She paused, just long enough for the distinction to register, then added, "The difference is not subtle in his language. It is definitive." The words did not land with force, but with clarity, like something being brought into focus after being blurred. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was no longer dismissive. It was listening. Naomi stood there, not elevated, not defended by title or position, but grounded in something that did not require either. For a brief moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of hierarchy and more like a place where truth had to find its way through whatever barriers had been built around it. And in that moment, Naomi was no longer invisible. She was simply undeniable. The shift, when it came, did not arrive as a loud declaration or a dramatic interruption, but as something quieter, more unsettling, like a truth settling into place where it had always belonged. Judge Hargrove leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer fixed on Naomi alone, but moving across the room, tracing the reactions he had learned to read with precision over decades. The interpreter's confidence had thinned, replaced by hesitation that showed in the way his fingers hovered above his notes, without landing. The prosecution attorney, who had been so certain just moments ago, now flipped through pages with a sharper urgency, as if the answer might be hidden somewhere he had already looked. And the defendant, still seated at the table, exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to suggest that something inside him had finally been understood. Hargrove's gaze returned to Naomi, but this time it carried something different, not disbelief, not dismissal, but recognition that something had shifted beyond his control. "Bring up the audio recording," he said, his voice steady, but quieter than before, as if the room no longer required force to listen. A clerk moved quickly, pressing a button on the console as a low static filled the air, followed by the faint, distant sound of the witness's voice captured at the scene. It was not clear at first, layered with background noise, but the language was unmistakable. Naomi did not move closer. She did not need to. She listened, her head slightly tilted, her focus narrowing to the rhythm, the structure, the subtle markers that separated one meaning from another. The room listened too, but without understanding, waiting for someone to interpret what they could not grasp. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. Judge Hargrove did not look at the interpreter. He looked at Naomi. "Translate it," he said. The words were not a challenge this time. They were a request. Naomi spoke without hesitation, repeating the original statement exactly as it had been said, then rendering it into English with the same clarity she had shown before. There was no rush, no embellishment, just accuracy. When she finished, the difference was no longer theoretical. It was undeniable. The meaning had changed everything. The prosecution attorney stopped turning pages. The interpreter lowered his hands. The defendant closed his eyes briefly, as if holding on to something that had almost been taken from him. Judge Hargrove remained still, his expression unreadable for a moment longer than anyone expected. Then, slowly, he nodded once, not to Naomi, not to the attorneys, but to the truth that had just been made visible. "The court will acknowledge the corrected translation," he said, his voice measured, but carrying a weight that settled across every corner of the room. It was not loud, but it was final. In that moment, the structure of authority did not collapse, but it adjusted, making space for something it had nearly overlooked. And Naomi Carter, who had entered the room as someone unseen, now stood at the center of a realization that no one in that courtroom could ignore any longer. The words settled into the courtroom like a quiet verdict before any formal ruling had been made, changing not just the direction of the case, but the way every person in that room now saw what had just happened. Judge Hargrove remained still for a moment longer, his hands resting against the edge of the bench, his gaze lowered slightly as if measuring something beyond the facts in front of him. When he finally looked up again, the shift was unmistakable, not in his authority, but in his awareness of it. His eyes moved to Naomi, no longer searching for error, no longer questioning her place, but acknowledging the weight of what she had done. "Miss Carter," he said, her name deliberate, spoken with a clarity that carried across the room. "Approach the bench." The request was simple, but it altered the space between them in a way that could not be undone. Naomi stepped forward, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor, the same path she had walked countless times before in silence, now carrying a different meaning with every step. The courtroom watched, not with curiosity this time, but with attention that held a different kind of respect, one that had not been offered before. When she reached the front, she stopped at the appropriate distance, her posture steady, her hands still relaxed at her sides. Judge Hargrove studied her for a brief second, then spoke again, his voice lower now, but clearer than it had been at the beginning of the hearing. The court recognizes that your intervention has corrected a critical error in this proceeding, he said, each word measured, not rushed, not softened. A pause followed, brief but significant. And it should not have required your position for your voice to be considered. The admission did not come with dramatics, but it carried a weight that settled deeper than any raised voice could have. Around the room, the shift continued, subtle but real, in the way the attorneys held their posture, in the way the interpreter lowered his gaze, in the way the defendant looked at Naomi not just with relief, but with gratitude that did not need to be spoken aloud. Naomi did not respond immediately. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not of the apology itself, but of the truth within it. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice even, without pride, without resentment, just clarity. Judge Hargrove inclined his head slightly, then straightened, returning to the structure of the courtroom, but with something changed beneath it. "The court will recess briefly to review the corrected testimony," he announced, the formal tone restored, but no longer untouched. The gavel came down once more, softer this time, less like a command and more like a continuation. As people began to move, the quiet hum of conversation returning in low, controlled tones, Naomi stepped back from the bench, retracing her steps toward the aisle. The light from the tall windows had shifted again, brighter now, stretching further across the floor, catching the edge of her jacket, the outline of her shoulders. She did not look back. She did not need to. For the first time since she had entered that room, she was not defined by where she stood, but by what she had revealed. And in that moment, the distance between power and truth felt smaller than it ever had before. The courthouse doors opened with a quiet push, and the world outside felt different, not louder, not brighter, but wider somehow, as if the air carried more space than it had before. Naomi stepped out onto the stone steps, the faint warmth of the late afternoon sun settling across her shoulders, replacing the cool, controlled atmosphere she had just left behind. The sounds of the city moved around her in steady rhythm, distant traffic, footsteps passing, voices blending into something continuous and alive. For a moment, she stood still at the top of the steps, not looking back, not searching for confirmation, just breathing in the shift. In her hand, she still held the folded cloth she had carried all day, the edges slightly worn, the fabric soft from use. It felt small now, almost insignificant compared to what had just happened, and yet it grounded her in a way nothing else could. Behind her, the courthouse doors opened again, and a few people stepped out, their conversations quieter than usual, their glances lingering just a second longer when they recognized her. Not with curiosity, not with surprise, but with something closer to acknowledgement. Naomi began to walk, her pace steady, her steps measured, moving down the wide stone staircase that she had climbed so many times before without being noticed. Each step carried her further from the echo of that room, but not away from what had been revealed inside it. At the bottom, she paused briefly, adjusting the sleeve of her jacket, the fabric catching the light in a way that made its simplicity feel almost deliberate. She slipped the folded cloth into her pocket, her fingers lingering there for a second before letting go. Across the street, a traffic light shifted from red to green, the flow of movement continuing without interruption, as it always did, indifferent to the quiet turning points that happened within walls like the ones behind her. Naomi stepped forward, crossing into that motion, becoming part of it again, but not in the same way she had before. The weight she carried was different now, not heavier, but clearer, as if something that had been waiting beneath the surface had finally been allowed to exist in the open. She did not need anyone to follow her, did not need the room to remember her name, did not need the recognition that had come too late to define what she already knew. The truth had been enough. As she reached the other side of the street, the light shifted again, casting a long reflection of her shadow across the pavement, stretching forward in front of her. She glanced down at it for a brief moment, then continued walking, her steps quiet but certain, blending into the rhythm of the city. Behind her, the courthouse stood unchanged, its structure solid, its presence constant, but something within it had moved, just enough to matter. And ahead of her, the path remained open, not marked by what she had been called, but shaped by what she had chosen to stand for, steady, unseen, and now, unmistakably real.